no matter what happens, no matter how down in the mouth he is, no matter how bad things are, he always has an incredibly bitchy retort. And, like, really, that is the queer experience.
I'm sure you've heard this from plenty of people, but Succession is the most interesting thing happening on TV right now. It just is. There's no way around it. It's beautifully written and shot, it's hilarious, and the dialogue is so cutting. Every performance, no matter how big or small, is just gripping and leaves you wanting more. And being part of Succession Twitter as it's airing is truly an experience like no other, which is where my fascination with the show's audience really began. So Succession falls under what I'd like to call the umbrella of prestige television, which has pretty much been dominated by HBO for several decades now. It started with The Sopranos, and then we got The Wire, Breaking Bad, The West Wing, Mad Men, all really top-notch, high-quality shows with, dare I say, more masculine audiences that reflected interest in them, at least at first glance. Succession also seems to fall in line with that from the perspective of an outsider looking in. All of the promotional material is a bunch of white dudes in suits looking concerned and foreboding. There's only one woman and she always seems to be having a bad time. Brian Cox is constantly telling people to fuck off.
Fuck off!
But the real hardcore Succession fans don't really reflect in the way that you'd think they would. In fact, before I even make any additional points, I'd like to show you a brief TikTok montage to get a sense of what these guys are really about.
I'm better than you. Sure. You're my son. I did my best. And whenever you fucked up, I cleaned up your shit.
Don't want pictures of my dick?
No.
Okay. Kind of offended, are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure. I'm fucking serious, Rome.
To put it simply, Succession at its core is truly a show for the girls, gays, and theys, even if it doesn't appear that way at first. Just cutting in here, because in celebration of me finally doing a Succession video, I thought I would get in my best Shiv Roy attire, my mean business lady core, and I wanted to actually cut in with a personal example of the demographic gap that happens when it comes to Succession. Basically, before season 4 started, I was talking with my coworker who was around my age, she's a little younger than me, about how much we love the show. And my boss, one of my bosses, who's, you know, older than us, he's a big fan of the show too, but he was just so surprised at, like, how into it we were, because, you know, everyone who loves Succession is super into Succession, and he just was like, wow, I didn't think that, like, people your age and, like, your demographic, like, would be super into it. And we were like, oh, you don't know the Succession girly Twitter. Like, you haven't been there, you haven't been in the trenches, you don't know. So I just thought that was really funny, and I wanted to share that personal anecdote. But don't just take my word for it. There are probably thousands of other examples of this phenomenon taking place in office spaces that employ a range of 40-year-olds with generational wealth to 20-year-olds who will never feasibly own property. And to further expand my horizons on this topic, I decided to interview a couple of Succession fans in my same demographic to get their take on why this show is just so gay without ever explicitly saying it. And before we move any further, I will say, spoiler warning for every episode of Succession that has aired on HBO as of April 25th. Succession is a dark drama / comedy about the Roy family. The patriarch of the Roys, Logan, founded a newspaper company that over time grew into a massive media empire like one of these guys here. Logan is old as shit, and the show basically centers around his 4 children, Kendall, Shiv, Roman, and Connor, trying to get in his good graces before he dies. Most of them want to take over the company, but Connor just wants to run for president.
Connor Roy was interested in politics at a very young age.
That's the plot on the surface, but underneath all of that are central themes about familial trauma, and that's where a lot of the emotional resonance with the characters actually comes in.
I think it's about, 4 children who are never enough for their parents, mostly because they can't live up to the gendered expectations that their parents have of them. Logan expects Connor, Kendall, and Roman to be a certain type of man that they just simply aren't capable of being. But ironically, the more they try to be that sort of man, the more he resents them.
I think also it has to do
with the relationship to the father, that also really gets me. Like, just as a young queer person, as a woman, I don't have a good relationship with my father, and none of them do either. So I think I have a lot of like, you know, I really like empathize with them when it comes to that, and the striving for acceptance, the striving for loving.
I see a lot of like parallels between like this fandom and then like the early 2010s like supernatural fandom, kind of like it does have that kind of feeling of it, but I don't think it's like queerbaity. I think that's one of the things that like it feels like a more adult version of that.
You may have heard the long-running critique, well, not even a critique I guess, more of just a statement, that all of the characters in Succession are bad people and that's part of the fun. I think that assertion is actually a little misguided. I don't think the characters in this show are bad people, they're broken people. They are starved for love and attention and approval and are ultimately a product of patriarchal violence in different ways. All of those character flaws manifest in a way that's easy for us as the audience to either laugh at or empathize with. And when Succession fans say they have a favorite character of the main siblings, they usually mean it's the sibling they want to protect the most from the violence happening to and around them. Take Kendall, for example. Kendall is usually interpreted as the main character of the show. He's basically primed to inherit the position of CEO from Logan, but Logan constantly manipulates and undermines him and dangles the role over his head because while he probably wants it the most, he's not perfect for it, in Logan's own words.
You're not a killer. You have to be a killer.
It's so real. It's so me. That's what I always say. Like, oh, Kendall Roy is so me, even though he is a 43-year-old man who is a billionaire, and I am none of those things.
Kendall also struggles with addiction, divorce, and being an absentee father, and he probably has the darkest storyline of the siblings, dealing with those things in like the worst, most tragic way possible. And yet, Kendall Roy is known simply as the internet's baby girl, quite literally. I mean, the way that online stans react to him is almost infantilizing, but not in a way that's even negative, really. I just think it's interesting how Kendall's trauma is so often feminized and interpreted through a more gentle lens. Contrast that with Shiv Roy, who starts the show as an outsider doing consulting work for political candidates. Shiv has probably more of a killer instinct than Kendall, and in my opinion, is probably who Logan believes is the most capable to take the job. But Shiv is a woman in a company rotted to the core with sexual harassment scandals and internalized misogyny, and she's often put in her place not because of her lack of competence, but because of the twisted societal hierarchy that she finds herself in.
As a bi woman who sort of lives kind of halfway between butch and femme on that spectrum, Shiv is very relatable to me because she's constantly having to negotiate how masculine or feminine to be in any space at any given time, often for her own safety or belonging. It's that constant negotiation of, you know, if I'm too emotional, if I'm too feminine, I lose my status with the boys, but the harder I try to fit in with the boys, the more impossible it becomes to connect with other women. I think that's a really relatable struggle.
She always just finds herself in awful situations. In the first episode, her own dad views her as a sexual object while he's dying and incapacitated. Or having to front a company-wide SA scandal that was handled terribly under the leadership of her father. She's betrayed by her own husband, who momentarily gets the upper hand on her just by virtue of being married to her and lucking out, and in the last episode, the only reason she gets the upper hand back is because she's able to weaponize her womanhood in front of a creepy European man who literally sends bags of blood to his female employees. Shiv is a woman who constantly has to align herself with patriarchal violence despite what she proclaims her values to actually be. And as a woman in a male-dominated industry, yeah, I get it. I totally get it. I totally feel and empathize with Shiv Roy when she girl bosses too close to the sun. And finally, let's talk about my favorite character, Roman Romulus Roy.
Like, I'm a Roman girl through and through. And
Yes! Yes,
it's like objectively horrendous. It's so horrible, but I'm like, yes, him and Jerry, another scene, let's go.
Roman has so much complexity and so many layers. I could do an entire video just on him. Roman is the classic fuck-up sibling who lived in his brother's shadow his whole life. He's a loose cannon with a smart mouth, but deep down has so many issues from implied childhood abuse and trauma that manifest in the most twisted, almost childlike ways well into his adulthood. He desperately wants everyone's approval in a way that often roadblocks all of his good business sense he actually does possess, and he's super emotional and impulsive, and it gets him into the most insane hijinks throughout the show. Roman is basically a child that never got the love he needed growing up from anyone, and he's permanently a blank slate who could actually thrive under the right leadership. And trust me, we'll get there. These characters don't exist in a vacuum though. What makes the show so much more personal is their interaction with all of the other players of the game. And this is where we will discuss what you all came here for, the ships. Succession is not, at first glance, a show that is sexual in nature. We'll get to this a bit more later, but it's not a show that has a ton of sex scenes or love triangles. It's all subtle and bubbling under the surface. And the writers know this, so the few crumbs that shippers do get from season to season sustain literal mountains of fan fiction for months. I'm not kidding, the peak of every Succession shipper's week is when two characters are in the same room as each other for more than 2 minutes and like, maybe they sustain eye contact with each other or maybe they hug. And believe it or not, most of the ships in this show are queer despite no character in the show explicitly being gay. Tom and Greg is the most obvious ship to start with here. Tom is Shiv Roy's husband, who is unhappy in their marriage because he's constantly experiencing imposter syndrome due to his out-of-place status in a wealthy family, and she's too emotionally unavailable and fucked up to be a true partner to somebody. Tom is constantly trying to climb the corporate ladder and takes Greg, a cousin of the Roy siblings, under his wing at Waystar to do all of his dirty work in that pursuit.
He's clearly a guy who's having some kind of like bonkers yonkers sexual awakening triggered by Greg, which is inherently very funny because Greg is very much, just some guy. And it's clearly shattered Tom's entire view of himself, and that's very funny.
Their dynamic has always been about Tom having some sort of control over someone because he is like the Greg of the executives. He's the butt of the jokes for all of them. But when he's with Greg, he's the one in charge.
I guess I would definitely call their on-screen presence a chemistry of sorts, but in a twisted and almost sinister way. Tom needs Greg and is incredibly protective over their relationship, so much so that he'll resort to violence and manipulation just to keep them together.
I just love that. They're so toxic. I love that Tom is pathetic with literally every other character except for Greg. Like, as soon as he has like one iota of power against another person, he like completely changes it.
This is all amplified, of course, by the Nero and Sporus metaphor in a half-correct Greek myth version that Tom tells to Greg. Basically, Nero is an emperor whose wife dies and he castrates a young slave named Sporus, makes him present as female, and marries him. The whole metaphor is explicitly very queer-coded and provides a bit in a foreshadowing way in the context of the story, as Shiv goes on to get knifed by Tom at the end of season 3, propelling Greg and Tom to Logan's inner circle. And it makes for one of the, most Tom-Greg moments in the Tom-Greg lore.
So, do you want to come with me, Sporus?
Can I ask for a little more information?
No. Don't think so. Listen, I have things to do. Do you want a deal with the devil?
Well, what am I gonna do with a soul anyways? Souls are boring. Boo, souls! Of course. Okay. All right.
So yeah, that's Tom Greg. Now let's move on to another gay ship in this show, Kendall and Stewie.
There's a reason the biggest and most vocal part of the fandom is honestly the Kendall girlies.
Yeah.
Like the Tom Gregs were out here, but like the Kendall girlies are the ones running the show, and Ken Stewie I think is even a bigger ship. I mean, I get it. When you see sort of the chemistry that Jeremy Strong and Ariane Moayed have, it's palpable, you know what I mean? Whether it's sexual or not, there's a there's a spark between them.
Stewie is Kendall's off-and-on business partner who he has known since childhood. He's really the only one who gets Kendall, while most other people find him sort of insufferable. It's kind of funny because out of the 3 siblings, Kendall canonically does fuck the most. We see him fuck his ex-wife Rava, he goes on a bender with Naomi Pierce at one point, but still everyone is like, yeah, okay, but what about Stewie? Like, can we just get to the part of the episode where Stewie is here and they do cocaine and give each other an awkward bro hug? Like, where's Stewie? I think the passion for this ship really comes from the fact that the audience just desperately wants to see Kendall have a good time because he's so miserable for most of the show, and when he's with Stewie, he seems to be having a pretty good life. I feel the worst for the Kendall-Stewie girlies because I think they get the least explicit ship material out of everyone. I mean, most of the time the 2 characters are just having business conversations, but this ship is so interesting to me, and I appreciate that the writers had them hugging one another in one of the more recent episodes because you can tell that Stewie really does understand Kendall, and that's, you know, what this man needs the most. And finally, this obviously isn't a queer ship, but let me just say, there's a reason why lesbians and bisexual people love J. Smith Cameron so much.
Tom, it's tough to have to tell you like this, but I'm in a sexual relationship with your mother. She talks in her sleep.
Roman and Jerry is a ship that exists in succession that I am going to be totally normal about. Basically, Jerry is Logan's general counsel and has been a trusted ally to the Roy family for a very long time. Jerry is probably the most business-savvy person in the whole company, and in season 2, she takes Roman under her wing and mentors him to try to get him up to speed to take on the CEO role. Basically, the writers noticed how much chemistry J. Smith Cameron and Kieran Culkin had during their improv takes and decided to write in the best unexpected subplot of any show ever, probably. You see, Roman has issues with intimacy. He cannot fuck his hot girlfriend and he much prefers jerking off. But we soon learn that Roman's issues run a lot deeper, as it's revealed that he has a degradation fetish, particularly when it comes to the hot lawyer lady that he spends all of his time with. So Jerry begins degrading Roman while he masturbates, he becomes obsessed with her, and then gets found out after accidentally sending a dick pic meant for her to his father's phone in a business meeting. This shit is so good. All of their moments just are executed so unbelievably perfectly, and it's some out-of-pocket shit that you just frankly would not expect from a show like this.
They write them so humanly, and I think that part of the reason why is because of, like, that contrast. I think that contrast is really interesting. Like, these, like, really horrible, like, people, like the kind of people you talk about when you talk about, like, eating the rich or whatever, like, and then having all that humanizing stuff, like, I think that contrast is what makes it super appealing.
And it further plays on the subversions that this show has when it comes to the main characters and the way they're perceived in terms of sex and gender. I know it's not queer, but it's still an interesting power dynamic that goes against the heteronormative, overly masculine relationships you tend to see in prestige television era shows. Basically, Succession is horny without ever being explicitly horny. I know Tom and Greg will never get married. I know Stewie and Kendall will never kiss. And I know that Roman and Jerry will never have hate sex at Logan's funeral. But I like to at least be a little delusional about that one because I will go down with this ship. So it's just interesting to me that I see so much posturing from TV reviewers about how Succession is a sexless show that's just about the business, when in reality every queer or feminine person I talk to sees it as the most sexually charged and emotionally devastating show on television right now.
I think a lot of these characters have kind of like a repressed sexuality to them, where it's really shown in just like how they interact with one another, and also shows like how impactful a relationship to your parents can impact your relationship with others.
I just think it's interesting how this demographic is so used to subtlety and having to hunt for meaning in a place where there often isn't any, that even when the writers are super in on it like they are in this case, it's almost like standard TV critics are watching an entirely different show. Ultimately, Succession will go down as one of the greatest works in modern television history, and for good reason. But for me, the fondest memories that I'll have of it are from the fan base that makes it such a blast to watch. And for every person out there that has found themselves so deeply in a character that is rich and so far removed from society and kind of an asshole, I hope the end of the season brings you everything you hope for, and I hope you're considering going to therapy if you're not in it already. I also wanted to just cut in and let everyone know that obviously there are allegations concerning Nicholaus Braun, who plays Greg on the show. I addressed them in another video that you can click on here, somewhere on the screen. But since that video, that first video, I've actually been in contact with fans of the show who are coordinating with reporters who are working on that story and compiling allegations. So I just wanted to mention that if you do have any kind of personal history with Nicholaus Braun, you know, engaging in creepy behavior online or whatever, definitely go, you know, to that resource. I'm going to link the description down below for you for all of the accounts that are involved in that effort. So that's it, and see you guys next time.
L to the OG, dude be the OG, and he playing like a pro, see, L to the OG, dude be the OG, and he playing.